Hi, thank you for joining us for this week's video. As I mentioned in last week's video, with the sweeping changes we had to the PPP Flexibility Act of 2020, we want to start unpacking some of those provisions to make sure that you make the most out of this loan program. So what we're going to talk about today is the PPP Flex Act and our strategy with payroll cost and our employees. We're going to see a little bit of a change to our strategic priorities. We're going to talk about using your PPP dollars to make forgiveness as easy as possible. The FTE, the full-time equivalency, reduction, exemptions, and how that was expanded upon. And we'll briefly touch on some of the latest SBA rulemaking just to keep you up to date with things. So we're going to have a change in our strategic priority. Namely, we prioritize the timeline over exhausting the funds. Now we're going to be able to prioritize exhausting the funds over utilizing the full of the timeline. And what I want to make sure that we do as we go through that process is look at creative ways to keep tracking as easy as possible, be conservative about your payroll costs, namely, look at it from the cash compensation perspective, and be mindful of that 60% threshold. As opposed to designing our expenditures around the 75% payroll cost threshold, now at 60%, it's more of something to be mindful of as opposed to strategize around. So focus on those cash compensation elements. You want to be able to capture those expenses as easily as possible, which you'll be able to do in your payroll system. Be mindful that FICA taxes are not forgiven. So that is an area that you want to just make sure you're tracking, so when you apply for forgiveness, the amount of federal taxes is excluded. The federal taxes you pay as an employer, not the withholding that your employees do. And be mindful of that $100,000 cap. I'm anticipating we'll get some additional rulemaking, but if we look at it from the covered period perspective, 100,000 divided by 52, that's going to give us $1,923 a week, or over the entirety of the time period, $46,154. So that's a number that you don't want to exceed for yourself, or if you've got associates in the practice, or really anybody else making $100,000 or more in your practice. We will not have an issue if we go above the 60% on the payroll cost side of things. The language is at least 60% to payroll costs, so it's possible that as you look at your payroll in 24 weeks, we can expend 100% on cash compensation. That's going to be a wonderful thing. It's easy for us to get forgiveness, and it's easy for us to document. The next piece when we look at moving away from payroll costs that I'd want you to focus on would be the rent expense, and that needs to be in line with the lease that was in force prior to February 15th of 2020. Now I kind of point those things out because there's two areas that I want to make sure we're keeping that easy, right? Those two expenses, cash compensation and rent. Because what about the employer retirement benefits? Well, there's additional tracking involved if you fund that up with PPP dollars. There is the complication between how that's treated for a sole proprietor, where that's disallowed, versus an S Corp or a C Corp where that is allowable. And there's a lack of SBA guidance when it comes to the covered time period. It gets back to that tricky language that they used in the CARES Act that they did not clean up in rulemaking of incurred versus accrued and paid versus incurred. So because we've got gray area in the retirement benefits piece of things, and because we'd have additional tracking with this larger time window that we have where we can focus on cash compensation, I'd encourage you to keep that where we use those PPP dollars, where we look for forgiveness, and keep that tracking as easy as possible. How about the health benefits side of things? Well, similar to the retirement benefits, there is going to be additional tracking and coordination involved when it comes to using PPP dollars for health benefits. Not to say that it's not allowed, but do want to be mindful. We've got to maintain these records for 6 years after we have the PPP loan forgiven or finalized. So if you take the PPP, we get some forgiveness, you keep the rest of it alone, we take advantage of that full 5-year amortization, you might be keeping these documents for 11 years. That's kind of the worst case scenario. But the lower the amount of documentation, the cleaner the expenditure is to it, the easier the forgiveness is going to be, and the more you're going to be just kind of bulletproof around an audit if the SBA ever comes looking for how were these dollars spent. The other piece that I wanted to make sure we touched on today were these additional FTE exemptions. So the first and major exemption that we were managing off of was the safe harbor. That by June 30th of 2020, we would have our staff back up and kind of back on payroll, and that was going to make it allowable for us to use the earlier unemployment expansion for your staff that we did as our practices were shut down, use the PPP to ramp back up, and look for that June 30th as our finish line. Well, they moved that finish line on us. That's now December 31st of 2020. A lot of you will not want to be sitting on this loan prepared for forgiveness until that time. So instead of waiting to exhaust the time period, we're going to be looking at how do we utilize the new full-time equivalent exemptions that are allowable for us. So prior, we had that if you offered your employees their position back at the same salary or at the same hourly rate and number of hours, and they declined, that they would not count against you for this forgiveness. Also the case that if somebody was terminated for cause, voluntarily resigned, or requested reduced hours, that they would not count against you. In the PPP Flexibility Act, we have additional tools for that FTE exemption from the reduction. And that is if you are unable to rehire or unable to fill the position with a qualified candidate, you're good. Now, that seems to be kind of disallowing or moving it more easily for us to be able to not have to have all of the written offers. But if you're not able to rehire somebody, they're not going to count against you. That makes it pretty easy. The other is if you're unable to return to the same level of business activity due to the requirements or guidance by HHS, CDC, or OSHA, that will not count against you. Now I highlight that business activity because it's not saying the same level of revenue. So for my clients and those of you out there who are watching this who are tacking on the additional PPE charge to your patients, if your revenue gets back to where it was before, but our business activity isn't back to where it was before, that can be a good exemption for why you don't have the same number of employees or the average number of employees over the covered period of the loan. Makes it easier for us to move forward with forgiveness without having to wait all the way until the end of the year. Now, there was also additional interim final rules that were passed by the SBA this past week. Really want to bring them to your attention. Nothing that was overly shocking, but for the remainder loans, if you get your PPP after June 5th, automatically your loan is going to have a 5-year term. If you got your PPP before June 5th, you may use the 2-year term. Now, from what we've seen, the majority of lenders are automatically assuming it's going to be a 5-year, but if you wanted to, you could have it as a 2-year term. Similar for the forgiveness period. So if you received your PPP after June 5th, you only have the option of the 24 weeks, which is the much more favorable option. If you got your PPP before June 5th, you may use the 8-week period. I'm not saying where that is going to be anything that we want to really kind of run towards because it's not going to change our ability to use the safe harbor date. That's going to be December 31st for everyone from all that we have seen so far. And because of the additional FTE reduction exemptions, we don't really necessarily have to wait until that finish line either anymore. And then the last piece is that loan partial forgiveness. In the PPP Flexibility Act of 2020, they used the term that 60% of loan proceeds must go to payroll cost. It was bad language that they used in an earlier interim final ruling that confused a lot of people out there because that would suggest that 60% of your loan amount needs to go towards payroll cost. So partial forgiveness would not be allowable because we're not going to be able to have that kind of metered underneath. Now, what the SBA rulemaking did was went back, changed that language, or really kind of reinterpreted that language in a creative way so that 60% of the forgiveness amount, so we're back to where we can have partial forgiveness if you don't use all of the funds, and we don't want to carry the loan going forward, that's going to give us some good flexibility. Now with that full 24-week cycle, I don't think many of you are going to have any issues exhausting the dollars, but we're going to continue to look at different strategies, pull apart the PPP Flex Act, have additional videos coming. So hopefully what we talked about today helps you think about how you want to strategize given the sweeping changes we've seen over the last couple of weeks. But if you do have any questions, please send them our way. Here is my contact information. Obviously, any of our practice integration advisors are going to be happy to help you with your questions, and we look forward to helping navigate this CARES Act, the PPP loan, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.